The night was unforgiving. Snow piled high against doorsteps, burying the world in an eerie, suffocating silence. The wind howled like a restless spirit, rattling the windows and tearing through the trees with icy fingers. Streetlights flickered, their weak glow barely cutting through the swirling snow. Cars sat motionless, their windshields glazed over with frost, abandoned under the relentless blizzard. There was no sign of life, no footsteps in the snow, just an overwhelming sense of stillness. Yet, beneath the storm's unyielding roar, something felt off, as if the town itself was holding its breath. And then, somewhere in the distance, a faint, muffled cry vanished into the wind. Daniel clenched the steering wheel, his knuckles white as he guided his car through the slippery roads. The heater barely kept the cold at bay, and his breath fogged the windshield despite his best attempts to clear it. The shift had been long, exhausting, and all he wanted was to get home. Home to Tommy. His headlights barely penetrated the thick snowfall, each turn of the road a guessing game against nature's wrath. The roads were deserted, the town asleep under its icy blanket. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard, later than he had promised. Guilt settled heavily in his chest. He pressed the gas a little harder. He needed to be home. His fingers drummed against the steering wheel as his thoughts wandered to Tommy. 6 years old. Too young to understand why his father worked so much. Too young to lose his mother. Daniel swallowed hard, the weight of it pressing against his ribcage. Tommy had been struggling, his bright eyes dimming a little more each day. Lately, Daniel had caught him staring out the window for hours, as if waiting for someone who would never return. I need to do better, Daniel thought. I will do better. He just had to get home. The shrill ring of his phone shattered the quiet hum of the car. He grabbed it, glancing at the screen. His neighbor, Mrs. Callahan. A flicker of confusion crossed his face before he answered. Daniel. Her voice was tight, urgent. Tommy's gone. The words hit him like a freight train. The world seemed to lurch, the storm outside suddenly insignificant compared to the one raging inside his chest. What do you mean, gone? His voice cracked. He was in his room an hour ago. But the panicked breaths on the other end told him this was real. Tommy was missing. His foot slammed on the brakes. The tires screeched, slipping on the ice before the car jerked to a stop. His heart pounded in his ears, drowning out everything else. The storm outside raged on, snow thickening, visibility fading. He gripped the wheel, his breaths coming in short, ragged bursts. Where would Tommy go? He was just a child. He wouldn't survive this cold. Panic surged through him, threatening to take over. But there was no time for fear. He threw the car into gear. He had to find his son, before it was too late. The wind howled against the house, rattling the windows as Tommy pulled his blanket tighter around his shoulders. The storm outside had grown fierce, but something, just barely audible over the shrieking wind, made him pause. A faint, desperate whimper. He sat up, heart pounding. Was it his imagination? No. There it was again. A soft cry muffled by the snow. He shuffled to the window, pressing his face against the cold glass, peering into the swirling darkness. A flicker of movement near the fence caught his eye. Without a second thought, Tommy slipped his boots on and crept downstairs, his breath hitching as he unlatched the back door. The icy wind stung his face, but he stepped forward, drawn by the sorrowful sound. His small frame shivered as he took careful steps onto the frozen ground, eyes scanning the yard for the source of the cry. Tommy's breath fogged in front of him as he cautiously moved toward the fence. The weak glow of the porch light barely reached the yard's edge, but as he drew closer, His heart clenched. A German shepherd lay curled near the fence, its body trembling violently. The dog's dark eyes met his, filled with fear, yet pleading for help. One of its front paws was trapped in the twisted wire, a thin line of blood staining the snow. "Hey, boy, it's okay," Tommy whispered, crouching beside it. He hesitated, unsure what to do. The dog let out another pained whimper, shifting slightly but unable to move. Tommy knew he had to help. He bit his lip, trying to steady his hands, which shook from both the cold and nerves. He reached out slowly, hoping the dog wouldn't snap at him in fear. Tommy's fingers were numb as he grasped the frigid metal wire, his teeth chattering as he tugged at it. The dog flinched, but didn't resist. "It's okay," he murmured, voice barely above the wind. His small hands struggled against the tightly wound metal, fingers slipping as he tried to pry it open. The dog whimpered again, jerking slightly, and Tommy winced. He had to be careful. His heart pounded harder as the wind picked up, whipping snow into his face. He blinked rapidly, determination settling deep in his chest. He tried again, pushing against the wire with all his strength. It barely budged. The dog whined, licking its lips anxiously. "Almost there," Tommy assured, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to comfort the dog or himself. Just a little more. But the ground beneath him was slick with ice, and as he shifted his weight, his foot suddenly slipped. Tommy barely had time to yelp as he lost his balance. His foot skidded on the ice, and before he could grab onto something, he tumbled backward. The slope behind the fence was small, but covered in thick snow and treacherous ice. His body twisted as he rolled, flailing arms trying to grab hold of anything. The world blurred in a dizzying whirl of white. His breath caught in his throat as his back slammed into the frozen ground, the impact rattling through his small frame. Dazed, he blinked up at the swirling snowfall. The cold pressed into him, biting through his jacket. Panic set in as he realized he had fallen past the fence line, down the slope leading into the forest. The trees loomed above, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. His breath quickened. The house was barely visible now, a warm glow swallowed by the storm, and then, his stomach twisted. He realized he wasn't alone. A thick silence stretched around him, broken only by the whistling wind. Tommy pushed himself up, his legs wobbly. Snow clung to his clothes, melting against his skin. He turned, searching for the way back, but everything looked the same. The house's lights were gone, hidden behind the trees. Fear tightened in his chest. "Dad?" he called, but the wind stole his voice. He took a shaky step forward, but the ground dipped unexpectedly, and he stumbled again. A heavy sense of dread settled over him. He was lost. A rustling sound made him freeze. His breath hitched. Something was moving through the snow, something large. His pulse pounded as he spun around, eyes wide. And then, through the haze of white, a shape emerged, the German shepherd. Despite its injured paw, the dog had freed itself and followed Tommy. It limped slightly but moved with purpose, shaking snow from its thick coat. Its dark eyes locked onto him with unwavering focus. For a brief moment, relief flooded through Tommy. He wasn't alone. The dog padded closer, sniffing him before nudging his hand with its cold nose. Tommy exhaled shakily. "You followed me," he whispered. The shepherd let out a soft woof, almost as if answering him. The fear didn't disappear, but something about the dog's presence grounded him. It sat beside him, its body warm against his leg, ears perked. Then it turned its head sharply, as if listening. Its muscles tensed. Tommy swallowed hard. The dog knew something he didn't, and whatever it was coming. Daniel's stomach lurched the moment he saw the open back door. Ice-cold dread flooded his veins. "Tommy!" His voice cracked as he rushed outside, snow crunching under his boots. His gaze darted around wildly. The yard was empty, but the footprints. Tiny, unsteady tracks led away from the house, vanishing over the slope. His heart slammed against his ribs. The storm was getting worse. He barely registered the sting of the wind as he took off, slipping slightly as he followed the tracks. "Tommy!" he shouted again, voice raw. Nothing. Fear twisted like a vice in his chest. His son was out there, alone in the freezing cold. He couldn't waste another second. Daniel's legs burned as he ran, lungs heaving. He followed the tracks, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The snow was deep, slowing him down. His mind raced. What had happened? Why had Tommy gone outside? Then he spotted it, just past the slope, faint tracks leading into the dense woods. His pulse pounded. He cupped his hands around his mouth. "Tommy!" The wind howled back at him. His gut twisted with terror, but he forced himself to move faster. His son needed him. Somewhere in the cold, somewhere in the dark, Tommy was waiting, and Daniel wouldn't stop until he found him. Tommy's eyes fluttered open, his breath coming in shallow gasps as a sharp gust of wind tore through the trees. His fingers twitched against the icy ground, numb and unresponsive. A deep, bone-chilling cold wrapped around his small frame, his jacket doing little to protect him. The darkness around him was thick, pressing in from every direction. The silence only broken by the sound of the wind howling through the branches. Panic surged through him. Where was he? How had he ended up here? A sharp pang of fear clutched at his chest as he tried to move, but his limbs felt like they belonged to someone else. His body trembled violently, his skin burning with the raw bite of the cold. He let out a weak cry, but the wind swallowed his voice, carrying it away into the night. His eyes darted around, searching for something, anything, that would make sense of his surroundings. But the world was a blur of white and shadow. Then he felt it, a presence, a warm breath against his cheek, a soft nudge at his arm. A rough, wet tongue swiped across Tommy's cold cheek, jolting him with a strange mix of comfort and confusion. He turned his head slightly, meeting a pair of deep brown eyes staring back at him. The German shepherd hovered close, its thick fur dusted with snow, its body partially curled around him. The dog nudged him again, insistently, as if urging him to stay awake. Tommy barely managed to lift a shaking hand, his fingers brushing against the dog's thick coat. The warmth beneath his touch sent a flicker of relief through him. Desperate for warmth, he pressed closer, burying his face in the thick fur. The steady rise and fall of the dog's body calmed his erratic breathing. The shepherd whined softly, its tail flicking, ears alert. It was watching the darkness beyond them, its instincts sharp, its body tense yet controlled. Despite its own exhaustion, the dog remained vigilant, refusing to let the boy slip away into unconsciousness. For the first time since waking up, Tommy felt safe. Daniel's boots crunched through the snow, his breath coming in harsh, uneven bursts as he followed the faint tracks leading away from the house. The footprints were small. Too small. Tommy's. His pulse thundered in his ears. The bitter wind stung his face, but he hardly noticed. He had to find his son. His mind swam with fear, imagining the worst. The storm had picked up, the temperature dropping fast. Then he saw them, paw prints, large, distinct, running alongside Tommy's tracks. His heart slammed against his ribs. A dog? The presence of another set of prints filled him with a strange mix of dread and hope. If it was a stray, could it have hurt Tommy? Or had it stayed with him? Clenching his fists, Daniel pushed forward, his voice hoarse as he called into the storm. "Tommy!" Tommy. Tommy shivered. His fingers curled into Buddy's fur as flashes of memory swirled through his mind. The nights he spent alone in his bed, staring at the ceiling, wishing someone would be there to hold him close. His mother's absence had left a hole nothing could fill. He had begged for a dog before. He had always imagined what it would be like, to have a friend who would never leave, who would always be there. But his father had always said no. And yet, here in the middle of the freezing woods, a stranger's dog was giving him everything he had longed for. Warmth, protection, companionship. Tommy's lip trembled, but this time it wasn't just from the cold. He clung to the shepherd tighter, his eyes stinging. The dog shifted, letting out a low, reassuring rumble as Tommy nuzzled against him. Despite the frigid air, the warmth between them was undeniable. Tommy's voice was barely above a whisper as he murmured, "Buddy?" The dog's ears flicked. Tommy let out a small, exhausted chuckle. "Yeah, Buddy, that's your name." The shepherd tilted his head slightly as if contemplating, then gave a single, slow blink. Acceptance. A sense of relief washed over Tommy. For the first time that night, he felt like he wasn't alone. A sudden, distant howl shattered the fragile quiet. Tommy stiffened. The sound was long, drawn out, carrying an eerie echo that seemed to swirl through the trees. Then another, closer. Buddy's body tensed, his muscles coiling as he shifted to his feet, his tail stiff, ears pinned forward. A low growl rumbled from deep within his chest. He stepped in front of Tommy, planting himself between the boy and the darkness beyond. Tommy's heart pounded. "Wolves?" he whispered. Buddy didn't move, his stance unwavering. The howls continued, some distant, some dangerously near. The storm had masked their presence before, but now they were no longer alone in the forest. Tommy's fingers dug into the thick fur. "What do we do, Buddy?" Buddy didn't answer, but his stance told Tommy everything he needed to know. They would fight if they had to. The wind shrieked through the trees, snow swirling like ghostly figures in the darkness. Tommy curled against Buddy's side, his body trembling, but not just from the cold anymore. His eyes were wide, fixed on the dark tree line. Buddy didn't budge. He stayed rooted, muscles taut, his gaze locked on the unseen threat. He was afraid. Tommy could feel it, but the dog wasn't backing down. Tommy swallowed hard. "You won't leave me, right?" His voice was fragile, small against the vast night. Buddy shifted, pressing his nose against Tommy's cheek for just a second. A reassurance, a silent vow. Tommy exhaled slowly. Despite everything, the fear, the cold, the darkness, he let his eyes drift closed. He trusted Buddy to keep him safe. And Buddy would not fail him. The night was thick with silence, save for the whisper of wind rustling through the towering pines. Tommy's breath hitched as he felt Buddy tense beneath him. From the darkness, glowing amber eyes blinked into existence. First one pair, then another, until a half-circle of wolves emerged from the shadows. Their low growls sent an icy chill through the boy's spine. He gripped Buddy's fur tightly, his small fingers digging into the thick coat, seeking comfort, seeking protection. The wolves were lean, their ribs pressing against their matted fur, their hunger evident in the way they stalked forward, slow, deliberate, patient. They were testing, waiting to see if the two figures before them would flee or fight. A deep, rumbling growl escaped Buddy's throat, his ears pinned back, his stance shifting as he placed himself squarely between Tommy and the wolves. His muscles rippled beneath his thick coat, his hackles raised like a bristling shield of defiance. Tommy had never seen his loyal companion like this before. Pure instinct, pure courage. The lead wolf took a step closer, its snout wrinkling, teeth flashing in the moonlight. Buddy bared his own fangs in response, a warning snarl reverberating through the clearing. The moment stretched taut, a fragile balance between challenge and submission. But there would be no retreat. Not for Buddy, not when Tommy needed him. A sharp bark shattered the stillness and Buddy lunged. Chaos erupted. Snarls and yelps tangled in the cold air as Buddy met the first wolf head-on, his powerful jaws snapping at the predator's throat. The other wolves hesitated, circling warily, their hunger warring with caution. Tommy stumbled backward, his heart pounding as he watched Buddy throw himself into the fray. Teeth clashed, paws kicked up dirt and snow, and the night echoed with the sounds of battle. Despite the overwhelming odds, Buddy fought with a fury born of devotion. His every move a declaration, Tommy would not be taken. A pained yelp tore through the night as one of the wolves found its mark. Its fangs sank deep into Buddy's hind leg, a vicious, bone-deep bite that sent the shepherd reeling. Tommy gasped, his throat tightening as he saw Buddy stagger. Blood darkened his fur, a stark contrast against the pale snow. But even in pain, Buddy did not falter. His eyes burned with determination as he twisted, his powerful jaws closing around the attacking wolf's shoulder. The wolf let out a shriek and released its grip, stumbling away. But the damage had been done. Buddy was hurt, badly. The other wolves hesitated. Their leader's whimpering retreat sent ripples of uncertainty through the pack. Buddy, though wounded, still stood firm, his snarls daring them to make another move. Blood dripped from his leg, staining the snow in uneven splotches, yet he refused to yield. One by one, the wolves began to back away, their hunger no match for the shepherd's unwavering spirit. Within moments, the pack melted into the darkness, their glowing eyes vanishing like dying embers. Silence returned, save for Buddy's labored breathing and Tommy's quiet sobs. Buddy limped back toward Tommy, his movements slow, deliberate. He whined softly, his tail giving a weak wag despite the pain. Tommy, his face streaked with tears, fell to his knees and wrapped his arms around his brave protector. "You saved me," he whispered, his voice trembling. Buddy nuzzled against him, offering comfort even as he wavered on unsteady legs. His duty was not yet done. Tommy was still in danger, still lost in the frozen wilderness. Buddy had to stay strong. For him. Tommy shivered violently, the cold finally breaking through his adrenaline-fueled haze. His fingers had gone numb, his limbs heavy as exhaustion seeped into his bones. His vision blurred as his body swayed, the edges of his world darkening. "No," he murmured, fighting the pull of unconsciousness. Buddy nudged him urgently, licking his frostbitten fingers, whining with increasing desperation. The shepherd knew. If Tommy succumbed to the cold now, he might never wake up again. The distant sound of footsteps crunching through snow barely registered in Tommy's fading awareness. Then a voice, raw with panic, shattered the night. "Tommy!" The name echoed through the trees, carried by the wind, desperate, searching. Buddy's ears perked, his tail wagging feebly. Another call, closer this time. "Tommy!" The boy's lips parted, a ghost of a sound escaping. He wanted to answer, wanted to cry out. But his body refused to obey. Buddy turned toward the sound and let out a single, broken bark. Daniel burst into the clearing, his lantern swinging wildly, his breath coming in frantic gasps. His eyes darted from the blood-stained snow to the limp form of his son, then to the shepherd standing protectively over him. His heart clenched at the sight of the wounded dog, at the unwavering loyalty in those deep brown eyes. Buddy had saved Tommy, had fought for him, had nearly died for him. Understanding crashed over him like a tidal wave, and without hesitation he knelt, gathering his son into his arms. "You're safe now, Tommy. You're safe." Tommy stirred weakly as his father cradled him close. Buddy, exhausted but determined, took a wobbly step forward, his gaze locked onto the boy he had sworn to protect. Daniel hesitated for only a second before reaching out, gently running a hand over Buddy's matted fur. "Come on, boy, let's get you home." With careful hands, he supported Buddy, guiding him alongside as they made their way through the trees, back toward warmth, toward safety, toward the home where Buddy had more than earned his place. Tommy's eyelids fluttered open, his body aching as he stirred beneath the heavy warmth of a thick blanket. The sterile scent of antiseptic lingered in the air. His mind felt sluggish, but the dim glow of the bedside lamp revealed a familiar figure sitting nearby. His father, Daniel, sat hunched forward, his hands clasped together, his eyes rimmed red with exhaustion and something deeper, guilt. Relief softened his features the moment Tommy turned his head. "You're awake," Daniel breathed, his voice thick with emotion. Confusion flickered in Tommy's eyes. The last thing he remembered was the blinding snow, the biting cold, and Buddy's strong presence by his side. Panic surged through him as his mind cleared. "Where's Buddy?" Before Daniel could answer, the door creaked open and a doctor entered. "You're a lucky kid, Tommy," he said with a gentle smile. "Mild frostbite, some dehydration, but you'll make a full recovery." He turned to Daniel. "He wouldn't have survived another hour out there. Whoever found him—" Daniel swallowed hard. "It wasn't me," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was Buddy." The doctor's smile faded into something softer, more solemn. "Then you owe that dog more than you can imagine." The weight of those words settled heavily in Daniel's chest. Tommy sat up too fast, wincing at the rush of dizziness. "Where's Buddy?" he demanded, his voice cracking. His father hesitated, and that moment of silence felt heavier than the storm that had nearly claimed them. "Dad?" Daniel took a slow breath, his gaze dropping. "He's not here, son." Tommy's heart pounded. "Where is he? Is he okay? He saved me." His voice rose, panic threading through every word. The air in the room grew thick with unspoken fears. "We need to see him. Now." Daniel barely had time to grab his coat before Tommy was stumbling out of bed, ignoring the doctor's protests. They drove in silence, the sound of the windshield wipers struggling against melting snow. Daniel's grip on the steering wheel was tight, his knuckles pale. Tommy sat rigid, his breath shallow. "He was okay when I blacked out," he whispered, as if saying it would make it true. Daniel's jaw clenched. He didn't have the heart to tell his son the truth, not until they saw Buddy for themselves. The clinic smelled of antiseptic and damp fur. The moment they stepped inside, Tommy spotted Buddy lying on the examination table. The German shepherd's coat was matted with dried blood, and his breathing was labored. But when his eyes met Tommy's, his tail thumped weakly. Daniel placed a firm hand on his son's shoulder. Sometimes, loving someone means knowing when to say goodbye. Tommy knelt beside Buddy, tears spilling onto the dog's fur. "You're my hero, Buddy." The dog lifted his head just enough to press his nose into Tommy's palm. Daniel knelt beside them, his own eyes damp. "Thank you," he whispered, "for saving my son." With one final, shuddering breath, Buddy's eyes fluttered shut. His tail gave one last weak thumb against the table, and then he was still. Tommy's sob echoed through the clinic. Tommy buried his face in his father's chest. Daniel, who had always been the pillar of strength, let his tears fall freely. They had lost a hero, but Buddy's legacy would never fade. He had given everything for love, and that was something they would carry forever. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the backyard. Daniel and Tommy stood side by side, their hands clasped in silent reverence. The gentle breeze carried the distant sounds of chirping birds, a stark contrast to the sorrow in their hearts. Tommy swallowed hard, his fingers tracing the worn collar in his hand. "Goodbye, buddy," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Daniel rested a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears. They had fought this moment, but now it was time to let go. With careful hands, Daniel placed a wooden plaque at the head of the small grave. The words, etched with love, read, "Buddy, a hero's heart never fades." Tommy knelt beside it, running his fingers over the letters, as if etching them into his soul. "You saved me, buddy," he murmured. A single tear fell onto the soil, merging with the earth that now held their beloved friend. They stood there for a long moment, honoring the dog who had changed their lives forever. The days passed, and though grief lingered, something inside Tommy had shifted. He walked with a newfound confidence, his shoulders no longer weighed down by loneliness. He had been quiet before, hesitant in school and distant from others. But now he found himself speaking up, laughing more and embracing the world Buddy had once guided him through. At night, he still reached for the empty spot at the foot of his bed, but instead of sadness, he felt gratitude. Buddy had given him strength, and that strength remained. Daniel had always been a man of routine. Work, home, repeat. His job had consumed him, leaving little room for moments with Tommy. But losing Buddy had forced him to stop and see what truly mattered. One evening, as he watched his son helping a neighbor with their dog, he realized something profound. He had spent so much time providing for Tommy, yet it was Buddy who had truly been there. With a deep breath, Daniel vowed to change that. The next morning, he surprised Tommy with an offer. "Let's do something together this weekend, just us." Tommy's face lit up at his father's suggestion. "Can we go to the shelter?" he asked eagerly. Inspired by Buddy's unwavering loyalty, Tommy had found a new purpose: helping other animals in need. Daniel hesitated, but when he saw the determination in his son's eyes, he nodded. That weekend, they spent hours at the animal shelter, feeding, cleaning, and playing with dogs who had no one else. With every wagging tail and grateful gaze, Tommy felt closer to Buddy, as if his best friend's legacy lived on in each animal they helped. One day, while volunteering at the shelter, Tommy noticed a trembling figure curled in the corner. A scared, abandoned dog with eyes full of fear. He knelt down, extending his hand, just as he had done for Buddy once before. The dog hesitated, then cautiously sniffed his fingers. At that moment, something clicked. Tommy looked up at his father, his heart pounding. "Dad, I think he needs us." Daniel saw the same light in his son's eyes that Buddy had once ignited, and so, with a knowing nod, they made the decision together. The little dog entered their home hesitantly, his paws barely making a sound against the floor. Tommy sat beside him, speaking in soft whispers, offering comfort and love. "You don't have to be scared anymore," he promised. They didn't bring him home to replace Buddy. Nothing ever could. But in giving another dog a chance, they honored Buddy's memory in the best way possible. Love didn't end with loss. It carried forward, growing in new and unexpected ways. As Tommy and Daniel watched their new companion settle in, they shared a quiet smile. They had both changed. Two souls once lost in their own ways, now finding purpose in the love an animal had given them. Tommy ran his fingers through the dog's fur, his heart swelling with a familiar warmth. Buddy taught us that the greatest heroes don't always have capes, he said softly. Sometimes they have 4 legs and a heart big enough to change the world.